Hello, test. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Happy Founders Day. You are very welcome to the Founders Day edition of Danquah Institute's lecture series. Today, I am privileged to have 3 academics with me to throw the spotlight on the unsung heroes of our independence struggle. We do know that in the fight to get independence for our dear nation, it didn't take a person. It didn't take 6 people. It took a lot more than that. And today we are going to discuss how these people, the ordinary men and women who helped to bring independence to our dear nation, did it, and lessons that we can also learn from these to also live our lives in a way that when we are gone, we will be remembered by generations yet unborn. I am privileged this morning to have, I'll start from my lady, Dr. Antoinette Tibudako. She's someone that needs no introduction, but for those of you who don't know, she is the executive director of Danquah Institute. She's also a research fellow at the Center for Social Policy Studies at the University of Ghana. Dr. Annie, you're welcome. I also have Dr. Hayford Mensah Ayrakwa. He likes to be called Ni Osa Mensah the First, aka Ochiame One, my very own Ochiame. Dr. Ayrakwa is also a lecturer at the University of Ghana and is currently the head of the Central Region Education Distance Learning Center. Doc, you are welcome.
Thank you.
And last but not least, today I happen to have all my favorite people here with me. It's Dr. Kweku Ajimanbudu. He's a lawyer and a senior law lecturer at GIMPA. There are other things I want to say about him, but he wants to bribe me, so I won't say them now. You are welcome, Doc.
Thank you.
Okay, and I am Abena Boateng. Some people call me Doris. I don't like it. Please change my name and make it Abena Boateng on the screen for me. So I am Abena Boateng, and I'll be your moderator this morning. You can send your questions as you listen to the submissions that will be made, and I will read your questions afterwards for our panelists to respond to. So, Dr. Annie, let me start with you. Our independence struggle to date. What do you want to say to us, looking at the history and the struggles and the people who contributed to making it what it has become?
Good morning, and thank you very much, Dr. Abena Boateng. Indeed, today is a memorable day, and for the whole of Ghana, it is a rare opportunity to keep understanding, remembering our history, and shedding more light on the independence struggle. So for me, I think it's very significant that we choose a day or we set a day aside in the whole 365 or 366 days in the year, where we remember all founders. Dr. Ababatin, if I may, let me talk about the beginning or the celebration of this Founders Day first and the significance before I talk about those who actually contributed to the independence struggle. So the Founders Day that we celebrate today was instituted on 16th April 2019, when the current president of the Republic of Ghana, His Excellency Nana Addo Danquah Akufo-Addo, assented to the Public Holidays Amendment Act and created this holiday to make us commemorate the founders. There's been a lot of naysayers and debate about it as to why we have Independence Day. And then we also have the 21st of September, when we celebrate the birthday of Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of Ghana. And the emphasis here is the fact that we celebrate Independence Day as a symbolic representation of the day when we got our freedom from British colonial rule. So you celebrate that day as the day for freedom and justice. It's the day when Ghana became an independent nation, the day when Ghana became the first country south of the Sahara to have received its independence from the colonial masters. So that is what symbolically the day is meant to be. And then we have the first president of Ghana's birthday, which we celebrate. We remember him as the first president. Very, very symbolic, very important personality. No matter what the arguments are, he was the first president of Ghana. And so we celebrate his birthday to remember him so that we never forget him in our history. But then we also talk about the fact that it's not only one person who brought us independence. It was a long struggle, it was a long fight. So what can we do to also ensure that all others who contributed to this independence struggle are also remembered? And for me, that is the significance of Founders Day. Besides that, it then tells us that we're recognizing all our heroes who have contributed to the growth and development of our country. So we are not only talking about our founders before independence or our founders at independence, but we are talking about all the heroes of our nation. And I'm sure you'd agree with me, the famous saying by Abraham Lincoln that says that a nation that does not honor its heroes will not long endure. And I always translate to say that a nation that does not honor its heroes, in fact, you are not worth dying for. Because what then are you telling the rest of the people? That when you struggle, you sacrifice, and you do something just for the good of your nation, you will not be rewarded. So I think most importantly today, we must lay emphasis on the fact that Founders Day is being celebrated, not just for the single person who became president, but for all those who contributed. And for me, it brings to mind this term that we say, who are the sunken heroes? So I think that we have lifted up certain personalities as part of the independence struggle, but who are the sunken heroes? Who are those who also contributed to the fight? And if you permit me, I'd like to talk about that as well. So there are notable persons, but going through our research or doing research to have this special discussion, I came to realize that one of the most significant groups that contributed to the independence struggle was our traditional leaders. And half of the time, we tend not to look at the role played by our traditional leaders. In fact, if you look at the wars that were fought before independence, that actually sent the Danes, the Dutch, and then eventually the British packing, then you realize that our traditional leaders were very symbolic or were very significant. They were strong. And I saw that we can go as far back as I found 3 brothers from the north, very strong men. Sitobo, who founded the Dagomba Kingdom, Yantuare, who founded the Musi Kingdom, and Tohogo, who founded the Mampusi Kingdom. And we also have Ghana chiefs like the Mampong Okai, whose daughter I read was actually a terror, and eventually they pushed her into a hole. But these were the really great traditional leaders who contributed to our independence. And that's what we mean when we say the struggle. So then we don't mean the immediate gain that we got on the 6th March 1957, but we are talking about the antecedents, the historic, evolution and the trajectory of events that came until we attained independence. And we have to talk about the Akwamus. how they defeated the Danes in 1693. We want to talk about the Commander and Asebu people. We want to talk about the almighty Danquah. We want to talk about how the Ashantis defeated McCarthy and he lost his life in the battle. We want to talk about the Ashantis further defeating the British in 1863. In 1865, the Fantis also. We talk about the Fanti Confederation, and we talk about the King Agwe, the newly crowned king of Cape Coast, who actually spelled it out in a document and told the British that what you are doing to us is illegal. So at the end of the day, we see that a significant and tremendous effort was put into the independence struggle, starting from the traditional leaders. And we remember that the Ghana that we know today at the time, that was referred to as Gold Coast, was actually comprising of little kingdoms and chiefdoms. So they had their own rule or their own systems of administration. And if the leaders of that day had not started to stand up to the British, it wouldn't have given rise for the Big Six that we are honoring. So we talk more about the Big Six on Founders Day, but the Big Six needed some underlying effort. They needed some coming together of the different groupings, and it was the traditional leaders that provided that impetus for them. So I think one of the groups that we should recognize today is those traditional leaders that have passed away long ago. These chiefs and mighty kings who fought wars with the British, Danes, and the Dutch, and helped us to come to realize that it was time for us to fight for our independence. The second group of people that I think significantly contributed to this fight were the ex-servicemen. Ex-servicemen. So at the time, history tells us that after the wars had been fought, a lot of people had this, ideology, or is it a myth, surrounding who the white man was supposed to be. Maybe, there's this saying that said that if you are going to church and you meet the white man, you've already met God, so you should turn around and go. So a majority of the people still didn't understand the fact that if you cut the white man, you would see red blood, just as if you cut the African, you would see red blood. So after the wars had been fought, imagine the numbers of people that were taken into the British Army to go and fight. When they came back, they realized that the white man can die just as we can also die. He's in fact not a god. He's not something that is immortal. He is one of us. So then, why is it that we should allow him, who is a human being, just as I am, to rule me? And then also the knowledge that a lot of our scholars got. And that brings us to the third group of people that contributed, the learned people and the scholars. So we had reached a time where after the wars, a lot of our citizens had traveled outside. They had gone, they had learned, they had exposure. And they had realized, even above all things, that the colonialists were using our own resources to rule us. It's not that they were bringing us anything to rule us, but they were taking what they could take from us, and then they were ensuring that they had enough resources to actually administer rule to us. If you are going to rule me with my own resources, then you might as well go and I can rule myself. I can take care of myself. So for me, these were the three main groups that contributed to the independence struggle: the traditionalists, the ex-servicemen, and then the learned people and the scholars. And then I'll come to the significant contribution of the ordinary Ghanaian, the awareness that had been created. And here we talk about the fact that newspapers, other things had now been circulated. People started to read and understand what exactly is happening. So looking at all these factors, it was time for us to fight for independence. And these are the four significant areas I'll talk about as being the contributory factors to our independence.
Wow, thank you very much for that insightful submission you have just made. I have learned so much from you. The first is that your submission has just put to rest this debate about where the apostrophe should be placed in Founders Day, as to whether it should be founder apostrophe S, to make it like we are talking about one person, or founders apostrophe, so that it takes into consideration all these wonderful people that you have just discussed and how all of them have played a role in bringing our independence to reality. Doc, let me continue with you before I move on to the other panelists. So you've mentioned some significant people and the contributions they have made. What are the key lessons we should learn from these as we celebrate Founders Day? I'll come back to other questions, but because you've mentioned these groups, I want to just, if you can give me 1 or 2 lessons, and then I'll come back to you.
Okay, I think one of the most important lessons that we should glean from the 4 groups of people that I have talked about, and again, I probably will refer to a lot of examples as I speak, is number 1, whatever we do, our traditional authorities form the basis of politics in our country. So how are we going to embrace them into our political discourse? There's a huge debate about the fact that as a traditional leader, you shouldn't put yourself on one side of the discourse. I mean, that kind of thing. I think it is rightly said because we don't want to also destroy the very crust on which our societies are built. Because if you allow partisanship or partisan politics, which is now beginning to be so deep to eat into the very crust of your society, you then start dividing families, clans, lineages, and that would be very bad for us. But I think we should also then ask ourselves that, what lessons do we learn from their involvement? In their involvement or in their struggle for independence, what was their foresight? What was what did they hope for us to gain? What was the reasons that pushed them into ensuring that we fought for that independence? In my opinion, the traditional leaders wanted more unity. They wanted us to search forward and be one Ghana, to understand that if we gained independence from the British, from the Danes, that's the Danish, the Dutch, and etc., and we could use our own resources to develop and move forward, we would do better as a nation. So they do form the base of politics. But the lessons that we learn from them is not the divisive politics that we are looking at today. It's the politics that says that we must learn to come together and build more cohesion. Okay, because if at that time the Ashantis, the Fantis, the Gans, the Dagombas, all these chiefdoms could come together. And look, they were individual kingdoms and powerful kings and chiefs of their own, if you look at history. But they all came together for us to form one Ghana. We need to take away ethnicity from our politics. We need to understand that the divisive politics that we are seeking to use to divide the Ghana into different ethnic groups is baseless. It won't work. It's something that we shouldn't even propagate. So for me, that's one of the first lessons, that traditional leaders should go back to those traditional leaders that came together united and fought for the independence of Ghana. And let's not allow divisive politics to eat into the very crust of our society. It will divide clans, it will divide lineages, and it will divide families. I also want to look at a very important lesson, and I'll just name these 2 before I go on. If you look at the people who struggled for independence, one of the things that I realized is these very first and early politicians all had a professional background, or they had a career, they had something they were doing. It saddens me today when people say that right after school, I'm going to go into politics. And I advise them that develop yourself first. They were teachers. Some of them were lawyers. There were even market queens who financed, or Sergeant for Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and financed the UGCC. Each of them had something, a career or a profession or an income earning, something to do before they entered into politics. I believe deeply and strongly that you contribute more to the democracy that we seek to enhance when you have a career, a profession, or you have developed yourself before you enter into that area. And some people may argue with me, but I believe that where we are going today, the development trajectory that we are following as a country, we are going to need people who have a better orientation or direction, that this is what I want to do, this is where I want to be. And then you add politics to it. So for me, these are the 2 most important points.
Thank you very much. Again, listening to you, I was just reflecting that people sometimes, well, of course, people who know me know that I plainly do politics. And people would come to me and say, you are an academic. Why are you so involved in politics? And I ask them, if I don't, who should? The KIA or who? But that is not to say that KIAs are not important in our development agenda, because as Edu said, in the struggle for independence, one market woman was worth more than a dozen Achimota graduates for Kwame Nkrumah. And so all of us are important in making a contribution, but develop yourself first. Thank you very much, Dr. Annie. I'll come back to you with other questions, but now let me go on to Dr. Hayford Ayrakwa. Doc, I'll just be with you. I just want to. So you said you will be talking to us. I saw your flyer that you will be talking to us about the founders' struggle for economic independence and the structural changes in Ghana's economy. My question to you, is there any light at the end of the tunnel? I'm giving your question back to you. Take it on.
All right, thank you, Dr. Boateng, for the opportunity to share my views on the subject. And I align very much with what Dr. Tibudakun rightly said. To answer your question, permit me to walk us through a little bit of what the issues were, the antecedents, the economic antecedents prior to independence. And like she said, one of the things that people realized was that indeed the people who were governing at the time were really not governing with our development in mind. And so a lot of people over time got to appreciate that if we don't get involved, things were not going to change, because the Ghana became, or the Gold Coast became more or less a place, a hub for raw materials to feed industries elsewhere. And so if you look at the period, let me not go too far into the 1800s, but around 1898, 1899, all the way to about when Governor Gorgesbeck took over the reins of the then Gold Coast, Ghana was doing pretty well. And we're getting a lot of export revenues, largely from cocoa export. And so there was so much happening. But somewhere in 1990, when Governor Gorgesbeck took over, there was an attempt to, look at alternative sources of revenue. And this was primarily because export prices, or the revenue we were making from the export of cocoa, had started dropping. And for example, at the time, we had about 83% of our export revenue coming solely from cocoa. So you can see that cocoa has been the backbone of the then Gold Coast till date. And so it remains an important commodity to all of us. And Gorgesbeck, in an attempt to try to solve this problem, decided to introduce a number of policy reforms. And one of them was the 10-year development plan that he introduced in 1920. And the idea was to be able to help expand infrastructure to allow for other resources that we have to boost our export potential. Again, most of these resources were in their primary form. And the idea was that let's export primary commodities, get some export earnings, but the actual reasons behind it, if you look into the economic literature, were to be able to support industries in Britain and other parts of the globe. And so within that 10-year development plan agenda, then the Great Depression set in. And so once the Great Depression set in, it became extremely difficult for us to continue to even make the kind of earnings we're making from cocoa. For example, in between 1927 and 1934, the revenue we made from export of cocoa dropped from 11.7 million pounds in 1927 to about 4 million pounds in 1934. And that was really significant. Now, from that time on, several development plans were introduced, all in an attempt to try and address the falling, the shortfalls in revenue. The other thing is that over time, people became more enlightened, people became more informed. And so the pressure started mounting on the leadership at the time. And like Dr. Tibudakun indicated, the academics were on the necks of these people. The chiefs were everybody was getting involved. And so we realized that they had to do something about it. So fast forward in 1948, 1949, the government at the time decided to again put up another 10-year development plan, which was supposed to span a period of 1950 to 1960. And the idea for that development plan was actually broken into two parts. The first part was supposed to help with provision of social support services and infrastructure development, etc. And within that period, the first half was started, and then our independence, based on what Dr. Atibu Dako said, we finally got our independence in that 1957. Now, when Nkrumah took over in 1957, at the time, the first half had expired. And so the second half of that 10-year development plan was taken over, and so it was launched in 1958. And one of the key things in that development plan was the building of a hydroelectric power plant, which now we call the Akosombo Dam, which again, for me, it's one of the greatest decisions of Nkrumah to be able to continue with the plan. But in 1961, Nkrumah decided to look at a more comprehensive plan that would encompass the kind of development the Ghanaian people were calling for. And so we're looking for issues of healthcare, education, and other social services. And so that led to the 7-year development plan of 1961. Now, you ask, where was the resources for Nkrumah to do all of these? The literature says that at the time Nkrumah took over in 1957, he inherited an amount of 250 million pounds. And that was more or less the money with which a lot of these development initiatives were embarked upon. Now, the launch of that 7-year development plan was really comprehensive. And if we had seen that policy run its full course, might have contributed. But the plan was anchored on revenue from cocoa again. And within that period, cocoa prices again began dropping. For example, in designing that plan, they were anticipating to get about 200 pounds per tonnage of cocoa. Unfortunately, global prices dropped, and to the point that it got to about 87 pounds per tonnage of cocoa. And that really pushed a lot of the plans that Nkrumah had within that 7-year development plan into disarray. Now, the other thing was that he was hoping that plan can be the backbone for agricultural transformation, in the agricultural transformation and industrialization. Now, industrialization in the sense that they were expecting to import a lot of machinery to support with the processing of agricultural produce which we have in Ghana. Now that your income level, your export was not doing well, it meant that you couldn't import the kind of equipment that you needed to import because now prices were really going so high. Globally, inflation was also on the rise. Now, the other thing that also affected the 7-year development plan of Nkrumah was the fact that, yes, as we all have come to appreciate, Nkrumah was a socialist. He more or less espoused the socialism ideology. And that meant that a lot of the things were state-driven. And it's, in effect, as economists would call it, it crowded out the private sector. He frustrated private businesses. And that meant that what local businesses could have contributed in helping to sustain the economy at the time, that was lost. And so businesses were not functioning in their right spaces anymore. And for a lot of these businesses that struggled, these were people that in the minds of Nkrumah were his enemies. Don't forget, most of them were behind Nkrumah coming to join the struggle and to fight for independence. So in response, what they did was that they increased taxes to be able to get more income. They increased borrowing from abroad. They imposed import controls. And all of these birthed other things, including black market and corruption. And so this is, once strategies are there, you realize that people begin to, find other ways of getting and taking advantage of the ordinary person. Now, it's noteworthy that despite Nkrumah's strong sense of nationalism, he demonstrated intolerance, as I indicated, towards indigenous business class. In fact, the literature, and you find a very, very outstanding economist indicating that for fear of possible opposition, political opposition, he had to frustrate those businesses so that, in other words, you weaken their base to not be able to stand to fight or to challenge some of the ideas that you profess. So as a result, Nkrumah preferred foreign investors to local businessmen. This led to a situation where political interest overshadowed economic rationalization. And this was partly one of the challenges that this country of ours have suffered from that time to date. Now, let me quickly run you through the post-Nkrumah era and, what I call the period of turmoil. A lot of, between 1966 and 1983, a lot of things happened. Several governments changed power. And so there were very short-term development plans that did not live their full period. Now, you will remember the famous Operation Feed Yourself, Operation Feed Your Industry. All of these were some plans that were instituted. Now, in 1983, given how the economy was going, in fact, in 1979, 81, 82, 83, we were doing negative growth as a country. And so we needed, from where we were going, it was quite bad. Inflation was somewhere around 123%. And even get it to buy was a problem. And so we had to fall on external support. So the World Bank IMF program of Economic Recovery Program was instituted. Now, this program, within a period of 2 to 3 years, had managed to reduce inflation by about 90% to about 33%. And quite a number of things happened. Now, as part of that policy, one of the critical things that the policy reform required was setting up of a state organization that will oversee and facilitate planning processes. And that is what led to the enactment of Act 479, which saw to the establishment of NDPC. Several policies, for example, in 1995, the Vision 2020 was launched. And the idea for Vision 2020 was to transform the country to middle income status in 25 years. And in 2001, this was changed or replaced to Ghana Poverty Reduction Strategy. That's 2001-2009, Poverty Reduction Strategy 1 and 2. And in 2009, a new vision was espoused to be the Ghana Shared Growth and Development Agenda, and which took us to all the way to 2017. Now, let me indicate, because your question to me was, I needed to set the stone. Is there a light at the tunnel? Definitely, I can see some light, but we have struggled as a country all these years. If you look at Gottisberg through to Nkrumah, through the turmoil period till date, because ideally, you have your foundation and you build on that foundation. Our economy, and in most developing economies, is agrarian-based. And what that means is that we need to have solid agricultural base, commercialized agriculture, to be able to transform, to feed our industries. And that will lead us to the services sector. Now, unfortunately, we have moved from agriculture being the driver of our economy to the services sector. Now, agriculture, even though currently is among the least contributing to the overall GDP, still remains one of the major and most important, if you ask me, sector of the economy, employing several thousands and millions of people. Now, what are we doing differently to be able to make sure that we move agriculture through industrialization, or agriculture becomes a bone for our industrialization effort? And that is where I see that there is a conscious effort in making agriculture attractive to all groups of people. Today, you find young people who are interested in agriculture. You find people who are pensioners who also are interested in agriculture. And all of these are based on deliberate policies. For example, the Planting for Food and Jobs, I have seen evidence of how people's lives have been transformed. I've seen evidence of young people who have left school and have taken full advantage of government policy of Planting for Food and Jobs, Rearing for Food and Jobs, taking advantage of these policies and are making significant impact for themselves and the people around them. And that is where I think I want to focus on. Now, this is also, I can tie this closely to the 1D1F initiative. If you have the base being solid and the effort at putting strategic factories across different parts of the country where they are guaranteed a supply of raw material, that means the young person who is going into that agricultural farming who alone and puts it into farming is guaranteed that a factory near me will be able to take my goods and give me commercial rate. And I wouldn't have to struggle and getting my commodities to go in waste, even after producing, which has been the case in most of the instances. And so, yes, I see some light at the end of the tunnel. If we will be able to continue to, harness all these potential. Now, let's add that if you have an educated workforce, you stand the chance of improving on your lots. Now, one of the things that usually you don't hear is the connecting the free senior high school policy to, for example, agriculture and even the industrialization drive that is ongoing. Now, you can have the average person. I keep saying that if you have somebody who is a vendor, sells cocoa by the roadside, who is educated, you can guarantee that you are likely to have a more nutritious cocoa, more hygienic cocoa, and several other benefits from it. And so if we have people going to agriculture who are enlightened, who can read and write, who understands the seasons and how to do things, it is better and means that you can easily connect these farmers to different buyers in different parts of the country and make and improve on their lots. So if you ask me, yes, I see a light at the end of the tunnel. However, provided we consolidate all these gains and continue to sustain what we have been able to achieve in the past few years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Irakwa. Wow. I know that by the time I leave here today, I'll be an economic expert, a legal expert, and also some policy expert. Thank you very much. That's very enlightening. People who know me know that I love money. And so listening to you, you mentioned some amount of money that immediately I picked on it like, oh, that's money that has been mentioned. So you did say that Nkrumah inherited some 250 million pounds. How much does it translate to today's terms? And then I'll ask my follow-up question, like about how much?
Well, so 250 million pounds in 1957, if you put it in today's terms, we're talking about 6.7 billion pounds.
Whoa. Wow. Okay. So that amount of money he got, obviously in 1957, would you say it was too small or good enough or too much for all that he did in the space of time?
I always want to situate my discussion in context. It's important. 1957, the question is, what was the population? Yes, Nkrumah invested a lot of that money in infrastructure development. At the same time, I felt that if we had invested a lot or brought everybody on board, especially empowered the private sector, done a few homework right, we could have made a lot more gain from that than we did. See, it's good to put in the factories and put people there to work. But if you don't have a sustainability plan, if you don't have, the technical know-how to manage these, it's like setting up and putting somebody there to run it. The person may be able to manage it for a period, but just be able to sustain some of the projects and initiatives when it had to go beyond that. And that is why I believe in private sector engagement. That money could have become a seed money to support industrialization drive. And trust me, if it was the private sector that was running that, would have made a lot more and transformed this country beyond what we saw. Again, the difference between that which Nkrumah did and this 1D, 1F, you see a sharp difference. What the 1D, 1F, for example, is doing, which I like and commend the government strongly. Initially, I didn't understand what I thought government was going to build factories like Nkrumah did. So I was pretty against that. But in looking at the policy document, I see that this 1D1F government is only serving as more or less a backbone to the private sector that is supposed to be leading the course for industrialization. So almost every 1D1F that we have in this country is run by a private entity, which for me guarantees sustainability, irrespective of, because if you are running a factory which is state-driven, you know how we are, how we prepare the minds of the people to know that this must be done to sustain it, to be able to contribute to national development. So I think it was huge money at the time. Even in today's context, 6.7 billion pounds is a lot of money. Trust me, if we have that kind of money in Ghana today, only God knows what we can do.
Yes. Let me ask another question quickly. And you were talking about, you partly answered the question I'm going to ask. Sorry. In the sense that Nkrumah embarked on agri commercialization and industrialization. We see that our president in his flagship policies is also embarking on the same or similar trajectory. You have indicated a sharp difference between the 1D1F and the kind of industrialization Nkrumah did. But what other differences do you see between what is being done now and what was done then? And what lessons can we learn from those?
Well, thank you. Again, there are some differences and some similarities. One of the key differences I would want to highlight is what I talked about in terms of the human capital, the workforce. Now, what we haven't come to see, for example, is how this enlightened youth are going to fit in this bigger picture in a few years to come. I indicated that if you have an enlightened workforce, it kind of has a trickling down effect on several other indicators that you're going to run. And so I'm pretty sure that we're going to have a lot more people who work in these factories who are more informed, who better understand why a machine works this way and not that way. And these are things that would help with maintaining the lifespan of any equipment. Again, I've seen a bit of, effort at connecting the different dots through the government digitalization agenda, and that is something that helps to connect the 1D1F, a factory in Breku, a factory in Wale, a factory in Boso, to possibly a market elsewhere in the world. Today, we live in a very small space. You can still be able to reach out to a potential buyer in China, in Uganda, sitting right on your farm. And that is something that, as a result of the digitalization and effort at bringing the different parts together into one space, we stand a chance of benefiting from that. There is also effort at infrastructure development. And for example, people are producing, and if the market is not too good, where do you keep them? Government is working at making sure that there is that warehousing system that allows farmers who are able to do all they have to do to store their produce, so that at the latter time, they will be able to sell when they need to. And warehousing receipts also allows them to even use their receipts as guarantee to take loans, to do other things. So these are all you see. When I look at all of these, it looks like a well thought through, weaved policies that is connected to each other. And that is why I said that, provided we don't abandon these dreams, because the driver of these ideas is the current president, His Excellency Danquah Akufo-Addo. Now, in 2.5 years or maximum, he's out as president of the Republic. Whoever takes over must know that this is something that is worth maintaining. And we have to work together as a people, like Dr. Atibu Dako indicated. We need to ensure that whoever takes over, what would bring benefits to us as a people? We cannot just put it aside and introduce new things. We need to work together, pull our hands together, and drive this agenda. So that is some of the differences I see in that initiative.
Thank you very much. I would like for you to hold your horses now. So I go to Dr. Ajimambudu and I'll come back to you for subsequent discussions. Doc, so you want to look at the constitutional evolution in Ghana. And my question to you is, how has the vision of our founders contributed to the growth of our current democracy?
How long do I have?
I'll stop you when I think you are talking too much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Boateng. So in researching for this particular program, I discovered or found out, I think, two new things or a few things that hitherto I didn't particularly know. So we know the significance of August 4th. So for instance, we know that the Aborigines Rights Protection Society was formed on August 4th, 1897, and we know the work they did in opposing some legislation that the British wanted to introduce, which has or had been introduced in other parts of Africa that contributed to the land tenure system and all those kinds of things. We know that the United Gold Coast Convention, UGCC, was formed on 4th August 1947 in Salt Pond. But there are two other things that I found out in terms of 4th August and its significance in Ghana. So for instance, on 4th August 1914, a few days or so after the start of the First World War, the Gold Coast forces invaded German colony of Togoland. And that's how come Togoland, which was a German colony, became part of the Gold Coast colony on 4th August 1914. Also, on 4th August 1947, the significance is Nifa Naranyeng. You remember when we switched from driving on the left side to the right side of the road. That also happened on 4th August 19. So those, that's just by the way, these are things that I came across. But if we're talking about the constitutional evolution of Ghana, there are, in my estimation, about 14 significant constitutions that we have had in from the pre-colonial times till present times. So we know that prior to independence, what we now refer to as Ghana was somewhat referred to as the Gold Coast Colony. As a matter of fact, the Gold Coast Colony was only limited to the areas around the forts and castles of the British, and subsequently they acquired some from the Danes and all those kinds of things. It wasn't until 1874, precisely 24th July 1874, whereby Royal Charter, the Gold Coast Colony, properly so-called, was created. But prior to that, we know that in 1844, or even if you go a step further, that the first contact that the indigenous people had with the British or with the foreign, the Europeans mostly who came here, was through trade. So in the case of the British, it was there was the UAC, the United African Company, a trading company of merchants trading to Africa, that essentially was running the affairs of the British in terms of their relationship with the people. It was subsequently that the British in 1843, through the passage of some legislation, the British Settlements Act, as well as the Foreign Jurisdictions Act, essentially resumed the governance of this space that they refer to as the Gold Coast. And we know that it culminated in the signing of the famous bond of 1844 between the British and some local chiefs, mainly Fanti chiefs, and we know the significance of the bond of 1844. 6th March 1844 was when it was done. So when we talk about our constitutional evolution and looking at foundational instruments that has or have paved the way for our current fight towards independence, and then subsequently the first formal constitution I would say that we had was the 1851. So in 1850, there was a constitution which essentially provided for the severance of ties between the Gold Coast and Sierra Leone. Remember, the Gold Coast was not a colony on its own. It was operating under Sierra Leone. So in 1850, by virtue of the enactments that were passed by the British, the Gold Coast became a colony on its own. And there were significant things that happened in terms of each of these constitutions. And what I'll try to do is to mention one or two significant impact of things that happened during these areas that we're talking about. So for instance, it was during this particular period or under the 1850 Constitution that the poll tax ordinance was enacted. And the idea was that I think it was about 1 shilling sterling annually was to be taxed. People were to pay that and all that. Interestingly, by the time it was abolished somewhere in 1861, it is estimated that about only £30,000 had been raised, which averaged about £3,000 a year or so. So that was not too successful. So fast forward to 1866, that was the second constitution that we had. And this revoked the 1851. And what it did was it constituted the Gold Coast and Lagos. So the Gold Coast and Lagos, as well as the Gambia, were constituted together to form the Gold Coast colony. So that's one of the things that we need to understand. And this moved on to 1874, like I talked about, when the colony was finally formalized. And aside from 1874, which was the third constitution, the fourth constitution, which is also significant, was the one of 1901. So the significance of 1901 was that by this time, for the first time, we had laid out the geographical boundaries of the colony because the British had managed to annex the Ashanti and Northern Territories to become part of the colony or part of their protectorate or however it is that it was described. And this constitution 1901 entered into force on 1st January 1902. So that's significant as well, and was under this constitution that the Gold Coast colony as then was able to annex the Togoland, German Togoland, like I said, during the First World War in 1914. The next constitution, which is the fifth one, is what is referred to as the Clifford Constitution of 1916, named after the governor then, Sir Hugh Clifford, and under this constitution, one significant thing that happened was that the executive and legislative councils that had been previously established under the previous constitutions, the legislative council being sort of like a council that made laws for the governance of the British territory, even though it wasn't in the form of a legislative assembly as we know it now. It took a while before it got to that point. It was maintained in the 1916 Constitution together with the Executive Council as well. And what happened was that the membership of the Legislative Council was increased from 9 members to 22 members, and they had both official and unofficial members. And one important thing too that we need to note about this constitution was that it included 3 chiefs, as well as 2 persons from the educated class, what is usually referred to as the intelligentsia or the intellectual class at that particular point in time. Then the 6th significant constitution that we had is the one named after Sir Gordon Gadgisberg, the 1925 Gadgisberg Constitution. And here the Legislative Council was increased to 30 members. For the first time, they introduced provincial councils for the various provinces that the colony had been divided into. And this essentially formed the basis for election of indigenous Ghanaians or Gold Coasters, if we may put it that way, into the Legislative Council. It was at this point in time too that significant effort was made, and it came to fruition in the terms of actually administering the Gold Coast colony through the passage of the Native Ordinance Act, which had been tried several times prior but wasn't successful. But under Gadgisberg's tenure, that was successful. And Dr. Ayoraka pointed out the fact that it was during Gettysburg time that aggressive infrastructural development was pursued in the Gold Coast. So that was a significant constitution. Then there's the one, the seventh one is the one named after Alan Burns, the Burns Constitution of 1946, where all the problems started. Not problems, but you get what I mean. It was yes, the issues. It was during this time that there were the riots of 1948 and all those kinds of things. So that didn't last long. And we know that in the Aidan Watson Commission's report, it made it clear that the processes that led to the enactment of the Burns Constitution was based on pre-World War II conditions, which weren't necessarily the same prevailing conditions at the time it was enacted. So that's why it's usually referred to as being outmoded at birth, or by the time it came into existence, its relevance was not, it wasn't even relevant at that particular point in time. We know the riots, we know what happened, the Big Six, they were arrested and all the things that happened subsequently. Then through the Watson Commission's report and it led to the establishment or the creation of a new constitution in 1951. And it was under the 1951 constitution that we can say that the Legislative Council that had existed for some time then, which was comprised mostly of British persons with a gradual introduction of native persons, including chiefs and the intellectual or elite class, developed or metamorphosized into a legislative assembly, properly so called. So it was under this constitution that leader of government business was introduced, and a subsequent amendment to this constitution introduced the position of prime minister. And Kwame Nkrumah was the prime minister that was elected under this particular constitution. Then this didn't also last too long, because by this time the independent movement had gained ground. Remember that the UGCC that was formed on 4th August 1947 was advocating for self-government within the shortest possible time. And this was because they saw or knew that it wasn't going to take overnight to gain independence, because the trial had begun many years before that particular point in time. But with the formation of the UGCC as the first political party, properly so-called, in the Gold Coast, signaled that movement towards independence. We all know what happened. Nkrumah was brought down on the recommendation of Akweje to be the General Secretary. And tying in with what Dr. Tibudaku said, all these people were not full-time politicians. They had their own professions. They were lawyers, businessmen, and so on and so forth. So Nkrumah, brought in to be the General Secretary for a while, in 1949, decided to form the CPP out of the UGCC, and we know what happened subsequently. But even though, and nobody, like my colleagues have all said, no one can discount the role Nkrumah played towards independence. But it cannot also be said that it was only one person that attained independence for Ghana. And I'm glad Dr. Tibudaku mentioned all these unsung heroes who played a role one way or the other towards that eventual outcome. No doubt that Nkrumah was the poster child or poster boy of independence, because he was the first prime minister when independence was attained and all those kinds of things. So by 1954, the 1954 Constitution was the 9th Constitution in which the Legislative Assembly membership was made up of 104 members, all elected on the basis of universal adult suffrage. So voting properly so-called was now introduced, and that was the significance of the 54 Constitution. Also, the Judicial Service Commission was created under this Constitution to advise on the appointment of judges and other judicial officers. The Office of the Auditor General was also created under this Constitution, and for the first time, there were detailed provisions on finance provided for under the 1954 Constitution, and that was the 9th Constitution. The 10th one is the 1957 Independence Constitution, which comprised of several instruments. Even though we say 1957 Constitution, it wasn't just one document that we can point to, like how now we can point to the 1992 Constitution to say this is our Constitution. It was made up of several documents, 4 documents. Importantly, we need to understand that there was a Ghana Enactment Constitution Order in Council, which was passed by the British monarchy. Then, most importantly, the Ghana Independence Act of 1957, which was an act of the British Parliament, essentially giving us our independence. So it was an act of the British Parliament that granted independence to Ghana or the Gold Coast as it then was. And there's some significant things that happened under the 57 Constitution. This was the time when the Deportation Act was enacted, and when we come to the Q&A, I'll fill in those gaps. There was the Preventive Detention Act that was also enacted, a famous PDA. There was the Avoidance of Discrimination Act, which interestingly was preempted by the opposition party. So they quickly joined and formed the United Party even before that act was passed. And there were several cases, and we'll talk about some of these when we go along. And there was a 1960 Republican Constitution. Remember that under the 57 Constitution, the Queen was still the monarch. So we were essentially operating the parliamentary system of governance that still is in the UK, where the Queen or the King, as the case may be, is the head of state and the Prime Minister is the head of government. So Nkrumah was the Prime Minister. There was the Queen that was the monarch, represented by the Governor General in the Gold Coast as well. So by 1960, pursuant to the referendum that was held in the country, and the elections that took place, the Republican Constitution came into effect on 1st July. And this severed ties finally with the British, where we now operated a presidential system of government, where we had an executive president who wielded both, who was both the head of state and head of government as well. And this 1960 Constitution is probably the most controversial of all the constitutions that we've had, especially because of the subsequent amendment in 1964 that did a number of things. Even before the amendments, the Constitution itself of 1960 in Article 55 gave special legislative powers to the first president and the first president alone, which meant that he could pass law by himself, even to the exclusion of Parliament. But that notwithstanding, the Constitution itself provided some safeguards in the sense that the judiciary had judicial review powers over that exercise of those special legislative powers. But then we saw what subsequently happened in the case of Inri Akoto and 7 others, which is one of the famous cases or infamous cases during this particular era of the 1960 Constitution. The amendment meant that the president could sack the Chief Justice at any time if he deemed it so fit, which he did. It changed the colors of the Ghana flag from red, gold, and green to red, white, and green, significance being the colors of the Convention People's Party. And there were so many things that happened. And that's why many scholars refer to this 1960 Constitution and the amendment thereof as probably one of the worst constitutions that we've had in terms of our constitutional evolution. But one thing we need to understand is that all throughout, all these constitutions that I've mentioned have been building on one another. So every time that we've had the Constitution, even in pre-independence times, the next time there's going to be another Constitution, the framers have always looked at what didn't work well in the previous one, what worked well, and how to build upon it. So for instance, from 1960, moving on to 1969, a critical review of the 1969 Constitution clearly shows that it is a direct reaction to the 1960 Constitution, that it felt that too much power was vested in the hands of one person. So one of the things the 69 Constitution did, which was the 12th Constitution in our in this story that we are telling, is that it split the executive into the president and the prime minister. So all executive power was not vested in the president. And contrary to what many people feel or believe, that the president under the 1969 Constitution was a ceremonial president, he was not. he actually wielded some executive power, which is clear from a reading of the 1969 Constitution, if you have the chance so to do. But the Prime Minister was the leader of government business, was the leader of the majority in Parliament, and was exercising some executive power as well. So, and there was significant things under the 69 Constitution as well. The case of Salah and Attorney General, which is another interesting thing that if we have time, we can go into. But most importantly, human rights were entrenched under the 1969 Constitution for the first time. Because in the 1960 Constitution, even though there were provisions on human rights, the Supreme Court in the case of Inri Akoto and 7 others, when the PDA was challenged, when Dr. J.B. Danquah, representing Akoto and 7 others, challenged the constitutionality of the PDA because of Article 13 of the 1960 Constitution, which granted rights that were supposed to be protected by the state and the president, the Supreme Court held that those rights were more of moral dictates. They didn't have legal force, and it was akin to the coronation oath of the monarch in the United Kingdom. So what the framers of the 69 Constitution did was that for the avoidance of doubts, they were not going to leave the guarantee of your rights, my rights, to the whims and caprices of an individual. So they entrenched those human rights provisions, and that's what we've seen manifest in the subsequent constitutions, the 79 Constitution up to the 1992 Constitution that we have now. Then there was a 79 Constitution, which brought Dr. Hilal Iman to power. We know that there were significant things that happened prior to that and in between that as well. This Constitution is important for one reason, several reasons, but one reason that I'll touch on because I know my time is up, that it introduced strict separation of powers in our governance system so that you couldn't be a member of parliament and be a minister of state as well. Also, the tenure of the executive, the president, was 4 years, but the tenure of parliament was 5 years. So there was an overlap as well in that regard. The constitution also prohibited coup d'etats, which manifested in the case of Kwachi, an attorney general, and subsequently under the 1992 Constitution. And these are things that we can spend days talking about and all that. But then finally, there's the 1992 Constitution, which came about as a result of the period of the PNDC and the agitations for a return to constitutional rules. So in a nutshell, these are the 14 constitutions that we've had. And this is the trajectory in terms of the historical evolution and development of these constitutions. Sorry for taking too much time.
No, you didn't. Actually, when you asked how much time you had, I was quite apprehensive because I thought it was going to be some boring law lecture that I can't sit through. But I really enjoyed every minute listening to you. And if I haven't learned anything, I've learned that we've had 14 constitutions so far. And that's something that I'm going to terrorize my students with moving forward. But Doc, my question to you, what have been some of the lessons that we've learned from all of these evolutions that we have gone through as a people? And how do these then reflect in our current constitutional disposition?
All right, so I'll give you a few examples of lessons. All right, so I'll give you a few examples of some of the lessons I think we've learned from our constitutional history and evolution. Remember, I mentioned that under the 57 Constitution, it was during this time that there was the enactment of the Deportation Act, the Preventive Detention Act, as well as the Avoidance of Discrimination. Deport persons from the country. I'll give you two cases, interesting cases that happened during this era, and the lessons that we've learned from it, which are currently reflected in our constitutional dispensation. The first case is the case of Laden, an attorney general. And this case had to do with two individuals. I believe they were Kumasi businessmen, Othman Lada and Amadou Baba. And these persons, pursuant to the Deportation Act, the deportation order was made to deport them from the country. And they challenged their deportation order because they insisted that they were citizens of Ghana, having been born in Ghana, so they were citizens by birth. And if you know anything about citizenship, you would know that one of the main types of citizenship that you have from which nothing can be done to you in terms of being deported is when you're a citizen by birth. So for example, I'm a citizen by birth. Ghana can't deport me to anywhere because I have nowhere else to go. But if you are citizenship by, say, registration or naturalization, you can lose that type of citizenship. So what happened was that they challenged the deportation order, and whilst the case was pending, what the Nkrumah government did and what the Minister of Interior at that particular point in time did was that they made Parliament, or they brought a bill before Parliament, which essentially, and the bill was captioned the Othman Laden and Amadou Baba Act. So it's a specific act to deport those specific persons, regardless of the challenge that they had put up in court. So their argument was that Parliament, in its wisdom, had passed an act of Parliament naming those two individuals, that for avoidance of doubt, they are to be deported from Ghana because their presence was not conducive to peace and so on and so forth. So they were deported. The case went before a British judge, and arguments were made on both sides. His decision was that because Parliament was sovereign, because it was parliamentary democracy that we were practicing, and the Constitution gave the government the right to pass laws for the good governance of the country, for peace and all those kinds of things. By virtue of that, the law was good, and that they had the power to deport those individuals. Fast forward to another case, which is interesting because then you start to see the contrast in terms of judicial thinking. And this case also came before the same British judge, Smith J. And this was the case of Balogun and Adusei. Similar facts to the Laden case, where an individual was deemed to be deported because his presence was not conducive to peace and so on and so forth. Before he could come to court, obviously they challenged the deportation order. The deportation had already taken place. He was put on a plane and he was sent away somewhere to Nigeria or something of that sort. So he was deported. And so on the date where the Minister of Interior and I think the Director of Prisons or something were to appear before court on contempt proceedings, that morning, Parliament passed an act indemnifying the Minister of Interior and the Director of Prisons, I believe, from any consequences for contempt of court. What that meant was that regardless of the fact that they were deemed to be in contempt and they were to appear before the court on that day, they came holding in their hands a law that had been passed by Parliament, indemnifying them from any consequences that can be meted on them for contempt of court, which meant that even if the court said they were guilty of contempt, there was nothing you could do. And so now Smith J, having been the same judge who in the Laden case said the Constitution, since the Constitution gave the government the power to enact laws for the good governance and so on and so forth, now was talking about how it was not prudent for the executive to be interfering with the judiciary and so on and so forth. And I mean, it was neither here nor there, because at the end of the day, there was nothing he could do, because the same Parliament that he said was sovereign, like the British Parliament, had passed the law saying that whatever punishment you're going to met out to Kobeduse and Co., we've already indemnified them from that. And that was it. What are the lessons that can be drawn from these two cases? We have subsequently realized that it does not make sense to vest all powers in Parliament. So that if you look at our current 1992 Constitution, Parliament, even though it is vested with legislative power, there are certain things it cannot do. For instance, it cannot pass legislation to essentially oust the jurisdiction of the court or change the decision of the court or something of that sort. It can pass legislation on anything as long as it is constitutional. But then there's an inherent safeguard in the sense that we can challenge the constitutionality of any act of Parliament as either being in excess of their powers or being in contravention of any provision of the Constitution. So that's one important lesson I think that we have learned that has manifested itself in our contemporary times. Another one was what I touched on earlier on, which emanated from the Ria Koto in Riakoto case, because the Riakoto case had to do with the Preventive Detention Act. And for those who may not know what the PDA was, the Preventive Detention Act was passed in 1958, and it gave power to the Governor General, exercised through the Minister of Interior, to essentially detain anyone for a period of 5 years, which was renewable subsequently for another period of 5 years or so, if they felt or believed or were satisfied that your future actions, not actions you've taken, your future actions would be prejudicial to the security of the state.
Okay.
Yes, so that was a PDA which was challenged by Dr. J.B. Danquah in the case of Inri Akoto and 7 others, because Bafo Akoto was arrested together with some other persons. And if you look at these persons, they were lorry drivers, bookmen, and things of that sort, and they were charged they were detained under the PDA. And arguments were made that the PDA was unconstitutional because the Constitution guaranteed freedom. And the thing was that even though Article 13 of the Constitution said that you cannot be criminal charges and court processes, you have to have your day in court. The PDA did not have any element of the state bringing the matter to court for them to justify why it was, even though you could go on habeas corpus. A habeas corpus application essentially saying that the one who has detained the other person should justify why the detention was lawful. The PDA essentially gave power, could detain you without recourse to the courts. So there was absolutely nothing. And the Supreme Court in the Riakoto case essentially said what I said earlier, that the provision of Article 13, which Dr. J.B. Danquah was arguing strenuously that it constituted a Bill of Rights guaranteed for all persons in Ghana, the Supreme Court said it was more of moral obligations, and that the only avenue for anyone who felt that the president had breached this moral obligation was to wait for elections to kick him out. Unfortunately, after 1964, there was not the possibility of any elections because Ghana became a one-party state, the CPP being the only political party in Ghana. What lessons have we learned from this? We've realized that human rights are fundamental, should not be left to the whims and caprices of any individual, regardless of who that person is, should be guaranteed for all persons. And regardless of the fact that you may have committed a crime, you are entitled to certain liberties. You are innocent until proven guilty. And the burden is on the state to prove your guilt, not you to prove your innocence. And these are fundamental principles that we have maintained into our current constitutional dispensation. So these are just some few examples of the lessons that we have learned and how it's influenced our current constitutional dispensation.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask you my second question before I go to Dr. Tibudako, and I want you to answer in 2 minutes. Do you think our current constitution reflects the vision of our founding parents, not just fathers, parents?
But you know I can't answer this in 2 minutes. This is
Try.
Our current constitution, I think to a large extent, and this is why I say that, because if you look at before the 69 constitution came into being, there was a commission that was established in 1968 that was to take a look at all our previous constitutions and build upon it. And that's how come we got the 1969 constitution. If you take the 1979 constitution as well, there was also a commission that was established in 1978. They were to take into consideration all our previous constitutions to fashion out a constitution. That's how we had the 79 constitution. Same thing happened with, essentially happened with the 92 constitution as well, where there was the National Commission on Democracy presented its report. There was a Constituent Assembly, Consultative Assembly, Committee of Experts drafted the constitution and all that. And their terms of reference was to look at all our previous constitutions to fashion out one for us. So in simple terms, I would say that yes, our current constitution to a large extent represents sort of the broad vision that we've had because it's been incremental. We've been building upon it. That is not to say that the constitution is perfect. But the argument has been by some scholars to the extent that for the fact that this constitution has guaranteed us the longest period of democracy, there must be something about it, regardless of all its flaws, and there are indeed flaws. People will talk about the indemnity clauses that were inserted and all those kinds of things. But I think broadly speaking, without going into details, because we can unpack it then if we go into details, but broadly speaking, I think it represents that broad vision that our founders had in terms of the kind of country that we want. Whether or not it is sustainable moving forward, and whether or not we need to have a thorough review or relook at some of the provisions, that's a subject that we can go into at another time.
Thank you. See, you could do it in 2 minutes. So this is something that's coming from someone on Zoom, and any of you can react to it. The person is essentially arguing that we shouldn't say we gained independence, but rather we regained independence because we were an independent sovereign state before the Europeans ever set foot in the Gold Coast. And the person has even drawn an analogy of the Asante-Hene's palace and how the sub-chiefs work as quote and unquote parliamentarians and the people who legislate and all of that. So any of you want to take that and
quickly,
react?
just quickly, and then the others can jump in. I think I get, and I to a large extent I agree with what he or she is saying. The reason why maybe we would say we gained independence was that prior to colonialism and the coming of the British, the Danes, the Dutch, and all those things, we weren't one homogeneous entity called Ghana. We were split into different ethnic groups all over the place and all that. So yes, within the kinship or chieftaincy systems and the various groupings, but because we were all brought together one way or the other, being in the lead up towards independence, that is why maybe you say we gained independence or we attained independence as an entity called Ghana. Because prior to that, there wasn't one entity called Ghana. There were several, and Dr. Tibudako in her presentation talked about different kingdoms that existed in this space that we refer to as Ghana. So yes, I agree with what he's saying, but the reason why maybe people will say we attained independence is because when all the different parts come together, that's when it formed Ghana. And like I said, even Togoland came on board in 1914. There was a plebiscite in 56 when they decided to stay as part of the country that would be called Ghana in 1957. So that will be my take on that.
All right. Dr. Tibudako, even though today's lecture is to throw the spotlight on the unsung heroes, we still cannot finish our discussion without talking about the Big Six, because that is what is taught to us in schools. Who are the Big Six, and what even brought them together to become the Big Six to bring us to where we are?
I think probably would want you to mention the names of the Big Six. We have the all-famous Dr. J.B. Danquah. Well, a bit partial because, of course, this is the Danquah Institute, and he's the godfather of the institute. So Joseph Kwame Chirechwe Bache Danquah. He was a scholar, lawyer, historian, and actually one of the founding fathers of Ghana. So he's the one, should I say, who brought together that group. But the chairperson of, or the chairman of the Big Six was actually not, he was a vice, yes, at the time. And we have Edward Akufo-Addo, who happens to be the father of His Excellency, the current president of Ghana. We have Emmanuel Obechebi Lamte. Osajefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was brought in to be the general secretary. I think Kweku and Hayford both talked about how the busy work schedule of all the others that came together. And then we had William Oforiatta. He was actually he actually won the seat in Akime-Boakwa during the 1951 Gold Coast election. He also later became the leader of the United Party, the first opposition party to Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's party. And he was an active member of the People's Movement for Freedom and Justice, if you remember. which campaigned against the union government concept by General J.K. Champo. And then we can also talk about Ebenezer Akwaji. Okay, was also a founding member of the United Gold Coast Convention. This was the first political party. And as Kweku has recounted, other significant events, which I didn't even know, also occurred on 4th August. So we celebrate the Big Six. Now, why did they become known as the Big Six? Following the march, you know, what happened at that time was I think it was under one of the guard chiefs, there was a protest against the increase, yes, Nick Abnabo was against the increase in prices. So after the World War, the recession, etc., prices of foreign goods had gone up. And everything was over. Everybody expected it to come. That wasn't coming down. Now, so it means the British was consistently bringing in their goods, selling it at a high price. So there was a revolt against it, that they want the prices, that if not, we would stop buying, or we would, what they say. They had decided at that time that they were going to all abscond. They would say no more European goods. So it was a rout or a revolution against purchasing European goods. And then, of course, there was the march, the 28th February occasion, where the ex-servicemen say, pay us our benefits, pay it to us. And that also became another issue. And it was a silent protest where they went on a silent march. And I think you all know 28th February Court Road, yes. And they were killed, they were shot down. So the innocent killing of these men, all these routes that was occurring at that time, led actually to the arrest of these individuals, saying that it was the United Gold Coast Convention that was behind the routes, etc. And they were all put into prison. And the 6 of them that were put into prison is what brought about the term the Big Six. Because actually what happened was, in doing them the injustice of putting them in prison, it rather gave them time to think together, to plan together, and to decide how they were going to fight for the independence. And I think that is a very key and essential part of this independence struggle when we come to talk about the Big Six.
Right. Let me ask you a follow-up. So we've deliberately thrown the attention to the Big Six, but in your submission, you also mentioned, your first submission, you mentioned some 4 groups of people that we haven't paid attention to. What other significant individuals can you also let us all learn about, so that we can also emulate their examples?
Okay, I think I can list as many of them. We can talk about, I've talked about the chiefs. We've talked about people such as George Kuntu Blankson and John Mensah Saba, who were the first to be appointed on the Legislative Council. I think they are all founders that we celebrate on this day. So I think we also want to talk about J.W. de Graaf Johnson. We want to talk about Casey Hayford. I mean, they were behind the Aborigines Rights Protection Society. We can also talk a lot about W.B. Van Leer. We can talk about Asafo Adjei. These were the people that came together at JB Danquah to form the Gold Coast Youth Conference. And that was actually the basis for the formation of the United Gold Coast Convention. But I want to emphasize here about women that I think also played a very deep and emphatic role in the independence struggle. I want to talk about Rebecca Nadede Aite. In fact, she's the one that we see on the face of Ghana's 50 pesewas coin. She campaigned for Dr. Nkrumah. She was a market woman. And you can imagine her finances. And for me, I see such political activists as people that we must emulate their example. She actually earned the nickname Dede Ashikai, meaning Dede flower. So she was a very important trader. I also talk about Susan Al-Hassan. She was the first member of parliament in the Northern Territory. And she's the first Ghanaian female to actually be appointed a minister. She also contributed greatly to our democracy. And her fearless activism during the colonial era led her to be recognized. And that's how she came into the ranks of politics. We can talk about Mabel Danquah. She was actually the wife of Dr. J.B. Danquah. So she strongly supported her husband. She strongly advocated fundamental human rights. She created awareness for self-governance through her works and advocated for women especially to play an active role in the fight against colonialism. In 1954, she became the first female member of Ghana's Legislative Assembly. We can talk about Theodosia Salome Okun, for whom we always recognize and for whom we can thank for the very, very beautiful flag that we have. I think across Africa, we have the red, gold, green playing in different areas, but the Ghana flag always stands out. It always stands out with the black sign. And so she was a Ghanaian teacher. And that's why I keep mentioning how different people came on board, but she was the one who designed the national flag of Ghana. We can talk about Agnes Oforiwa Tegu Kwakupum. We can also talk about Hannah Esibedu Kujo. We can talk about Gloria Amonikwe. So there were significant contributions made by women in the independence struggle, and I wanted to lay emphasis on that as well.
Right, thank you. My last question to you is, what are some of the key characteristics of the struggle that are being played out in our current democracy?
Okay. So for me, I think there are 5 things that I want to speak to here. The first is the fact that leadership has to have clear strategy. Okay. Meaning that if you look at the struggle and you look at all of them that came up as leaders, they had a certain mindset and strategy which they were going to use to achieve a certain aim. And that also plays in our current democracy. Every president that has comes with a manifesto and a vision. And it's important for us to ask, you have brought us, where are we going? What is your vision? What is the end road to which we must see you taking us? We need to have that clear strategy. And it is very, very important for us in our democracy to look at this. As a leader, what is your strategy? What are you saying you will do for the people of Ghana? I think that also brings us to the very important point, number 2, on ideology and belief. How do we subscribe to a specific ideology or belief? I think we are losing a little bit of the political discourse because we are not going back to trace our ideologies and our beliefs and looking at where we are going based on these ideologies and beliefs. So I think it is time for us to also lay a lot of emphasis on that and encourage our young people who are now entering into the world of political discourse to subscribe to an ideology and belief. If not, we will lose them. They need to understand where we are going, where we've come from, where we are going, and what we have arrived at, or why we subscribe to a specific ideology and belief. I also believe that we also have to look at the mindset of the people. If people embrace change, they must have a mindset. If you look at the 1957 independence and the struggle that led to it, you can see from traditional leaders, from all walks of life, people just wanted the British to go. So that feeds into the change that you are then seeking. Okay. And then I also want to emphasize on the fact that there are always people who would take up frontline politics, but that shouldn't stop other people from doing so. So there was a big 6, but does it mean that other people just left only the big 6? No, there were other people. And that says that you and I can also play a role. It shouldn't only be our members of parliament, our ministers and the president who play a role in making the country better or the development better. It's a call for all of us to join, okay, to make our democracy and our development better. And then finally, I want to talk about the fact that in all the research that we have all done, we went and looked at history and documents that exist. And I think that's a call for us as citizens of Ghana to be decorous in the words that we use. I get very upset when I hear people using certain words for president. And I always tell people that don't do it. 30, 40, 50 years from now, do we want to go to our history books and see our president being referred to in such terms and words? I think that will be very denigrating. And we probably will get those generations rather questioning us and saying, how low did we stoop to go and address a president as a criminal? So I think we have to be very decorous in some of the words we use because it is history and it is document. These are the things that we will go back to and keep referring to let later generations know that this is what happened. So when we talk about the independence struggle, we're not talking about what is happening today. We're talking about what happened years back. And you trace and it's a whole evolution process. So these are documents that are going to remain in our archives forever. So as much as possible, let's be truthful. Let's use words carefully. and let's make sure that we honor our heroes and our leaders. Thank you.
Between free SHS, 1D, 1F, planting for food and jobs, and then rearing for jobs. But I sit here and I'm reflecting on how free SHS is being constantly demonized, like it's the worst thing that's ever been foisted on the people of Ghana. But you were just talking about how an educated person will even maintain equipment better, and that translates into the sustainability of our projects and industrialization agenda. My question to you is, what does educating young people mean for the vision of Ghana beyond aid as the president is seeking for us to achieve?
Okay, thank you. So the Ghana Beyond Aid vision or agenda essentially is trying to create that environment that allows every person in Ghana opportunities to develop themselves to the fullest potential. And so irrespective of where you are born, who your parents are, whether they are educated or not, whether you are in the city or in the rural area, you should be able to have an equal opportunity to develop yourself to the highest possible that you ever aspire to. And in doing that, you will make sure that the vision is to ensure that we have access to basic resources, basic services that allows us to be able to develop our potential, i.e. education, health, and all the likes. So if you ask me how the free SHS is helping to advance the Ghana Beyond Aid agenda, my response would be, we are having a situation where every young person, and I have seen people from nowhere accessing certain kind of schools that in the past would never have dreamt that they were ever going to attend such schools. But the free SHS has made it possible for them to interact, to access education, some of the best high schools in this country. And my own alma mater, for a very long time, we have never featured at the science and maths quiz. But since the inception of free SHS, we have gone to the science and maths quiz. And this year in the Eastern Regional Champions, we are coming to the national champions next.
Shout out to your alma mater.
Oh yeah, Boso Senior High Technical School. We are coming really, And so these are all some of the opportunities that the Ghana Beyond Aid is seeking to bring. Now, some of these young people who are getting opportunity to represent the school at other levels, you can imagine the kind of confidence we are building in them, the ability to do things that ordinarily they thought they wouldn't be able to do. So I think that it is a great opportunity. It is something anybody, if you ask me, if you look at the welfare economics literature, education has always been seen as one of the defining indicators, welfare indicators. And if you educate anybody, you have literally presented them with an endless opportunity. The sky is not even a limit. And so I think that for me, one of the best things that have happened to this country is the opportunity given to young people to be educated. And so if a child starts crèche, you can guarantee that at least that child can finish senior high school, which is significant. As we conduct our modeling here and there, we always want to see how education plays out in the outcomes of several research questions that we want to put out there. And you almost always see that education is an important variable in the development discussion. And tying that closely, I think that yes, there might be there are some challenges that the free SHS is experiencing. And I think that it is only fair that when you roll out a policy, and there are challenges, you take a look at the challenges and build on it. And so I think I want to encourage the implementers of the policy to look at and listen to the challenges that people are raising, and let's work together to address them so that this policy is sustained irrespective of who is in power.
Right. Just this week, I was in a conversation with an old professor, and this issue came up, how free SHS is being demonized. And what he said was that for him, irrespective of the challenges, the question we should ask at the end of the day is, are people getting educated or not?
Good question.
Because he sat on the floor. In his days, it wasn't free SHS. He sat on the ground to study. And at the end, he's a professor. He couldn't have become, looking at where he comes from and all the challenges that he had. And so I think I agree with you that we should maintain this and sustain it irrespective of what happens in the future. Now, just again, coming back to your submission and giving us some economic achievements and challenges that we have gone through up to this point. My last question to you is, what are the prospects for us as a country for the future?
If you look at, let me take it again from the Ghana Beyond Aid document, the Ghana Beyond Aid Charter. I've tried to look at some of the reviews and comments from around the world. And one of the things that you see cut across is they consider it to be very ambitious, policy that the Ghana government, and you don't find an African or a developing country wanting to, move that way. And for me, it speaks volumes that this is the vision that we want to achieve. We are not waiting for anybody to come and tell us how we should do what. We are thinking the next generation. We are thinking the next 2 generations and say, this is how we want to. We want to be self-sustaining. We want to be able to do things the way we want to do. We want the average Ghanaian to be able to do it. And to be able to sustain some of these initiatives and this vision. We're talking about the founders of our country today and the kind of vision they had. To be able to sustain such vision for the next generation, I think that we need to consider making some of these policies a part of our curriculum from the very basic. It should be a Ghana agenda. It should be a Ghana thing. This is not about any political party. It should be a Ghana-driven agenda. So a child who is in primary school should be able to know that this is what we are working towards to achieve. And the second thing I will talk about is that as part of this thing, the prospects, we need to invest heavily in our technical and vocational institutions, which I think I've seen some investments going these days. And I want to encourage that a lot more should be done in that area. The Technical and Vocational Institute, because that is the workforce, the base that will support our industrialization drive. And so if we are able to empower young people in that area, it would help us to sustain this Ghana Beyond Aid vision. Again, I want to encourage, as part of the prospects, that we look at building an entrepreneurial generation. Naturally, the average Ghanaian is very entrepreneurial. It's just a way of helping us to restructure things in a more acceptable way that allows us to participate in the global market. That is what we need. And let's take advantage of the headquarters of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area sited in Accra. Okay. Let's take advantage of this. Let's find out what is in there for us. There are several policies. I've asked some people who unfortunately have no idea what kind of policies exist to support the kind of things they are doing. Let us be a bit more inquiring and get to understand what policies exist and how we can benefit from them. And I want to encourage that when the young people also come forward, let us see how we can support to build this country together beyond that. Because like Dr. Tibu Dako said, some 50, 100 years, you and I may not be here, but the history will be written and possibly this conversation might pop up.
Thank you very much. Now I come to Dr. Ajimambudu. Doc, lately there's been a lot of I don't want to call it noise. Okay, so calls have been made for a constitutional amendment or an adoption of an entirely new constitution. In your opinion, do you think it's time for a 15th constitution? Are those calls based on any solid facts, or you think we should go with what we have?
Difficult question. So I read recently during the independence, the 6th March 1957, during the session in Parliament, where I think the Duchess or is it Duke of Kent came representing the Queen. The Vice President of the United States, then Richard Nixon, led the US delegation to Parliament. And there was Dr. Kwame Nkrumah moved a motion to deliver a statement to respond to the statement that had been read on behalf of the Queen. And the leader of the opposition at that time, Dr. Buzia, in his response to that particular in seconding the motion, also delivered a speech of some sort, which was, I think JB Danquah sent him a telegram to congratulate him on the speech that he made. Richard Nixon was wowed by the speech. And one thing that which he said was that, I'm paraphrasing here, a constitution on its own does not necessarily change the fortunes of a country, but rather it is up to the people to make up their mind to work in one accord to ensure that the ideals of the Constitution will manifest in their lives. So in terms of your question, whether the time is now to adopt a new Constitution or amend the Constitution, there are several schools of thought, two main schools of thought. There's a school of thought that suggests that you shouldn't be amending or changing constitutions and when at will to react to situations. So a typical example is the American Constitution, it was adopted somewhere in 1787 or something of that sort. And it's lasted over 200 years. There's been about 20 something amendments, and the Constitution itself is just about 7 articles. Very short. But what has happened in those 200 years is that the courts, because of the respect and reverence that they have for their courts, which traces its roots back to the 1803 case, early 1800s case of Marbury and Madison, where the Supreme Court of the United States asserted their right of judicial review, the fact that they can hold the government to account, the fact that they can declare an act of Congress, fact that Congress cannot act in excess of its powers. So through judicial interpretation and judicial review by that, they've been able to go along, interpret the Constitution in so many ways. We're interested to note that the original text of the American Constitution did not even necessarily recognize Black people as full persons for the purposes of taxation and for of ownership of property and things of that sort. But it was through the same amendment of the Constitution and interpretation that was placed on the Constitution subsequently that they were able to move beyond that thinking, the slavery sort of mentality and things of that sort. Even to this date, many students of constitutional law and politics would recognize the idea of separate but equal. The fact that in the United States there was segregation, essentially apartheid, where there were separate schools for Black people, separate schools for white people, separate benches for whites, Blacks, separate restaurants, and all those kinds of things. And the thinking in the early times was that separate but equal. So as long as you have facilities that are for Black people and those that are for whites, you're equal. But we moved on from that separate but equal in the case of Brown and Board of Education, where the Supreme Court essentially held that those laws were unconstitutional and that it didn't make sense to separate, even in buses, There were places for Black people and places for white people and things of that sort. So through constitutional interpretation and through the powers that the courts have, they can interpret a constitution or place meaning on the constitution in so many ways as to resolve all types of problems that may be foreseeable. There's another school of thought that also believes that, well, if a constitution is not working for you, by all means, amend it. Go ahead and amend it and review it. And that's what we did, I think, about 20 or so years after our constitution. There was a Constitution Review Commission that came up with a comprehensive document in terms of reviewing the Constitution, the various provisions of the Constitution. So these are the two main schools of thought in terms of what to do with the Constitution. Like I said earlier on, I do not necessarily think that our Constitution caters for every single thing and is probably ideal for the circumstances we find ourselves in. But like Dr. Buzia said, the Constitution on its own it's not self-executing or does not solve your problems for you if we, the people, do not make up our minds to ensure that it works the way in manner in which it's supposed to work. So if there's a need for amendment, and thankfully our Constitution 1992 provides the processes for amendment the Constitution. If need be, so be it. If we want to holistically review it as it was done a few years ago and want to revisit that as well, by all means. If we're going to also go the route of the United States, allow the courts to progressively interpret the Constitution, given the new challenges that we may face, that's also another way to go. So I really think it's based on your perspective and the philosophy with which you identify with. I know our current president is not too keen on a holistic review of a constitution, and he may come from that school of thought that will be that let's go along, that doesn't mean that the constitution is perfect, but let's allow it to progress, let the courts be able to interpret it in a way that meets our needs in our contemporary times.
Thank you very much. At this point, I want to give the opportunity for two people online to ask questions. There's a hand that's been raised for a while. I think the name is Suapo or something. Do you want to unmute and ask your question? SUAPO, if you still have a question that hasn't been answered, yes, your hand was up for a while. Do we still have the hand up? While we're waiting, Dr. Tibudaku, there's a question from Zoom for you. I'm going to read it as it came. Dr. Tibudaku has enumerated selfless devotion, commitment, and patriotism of these founding members of our cherished democracy. Can she attest to same attributes in our modern day contemporary politics?
Okay. That's a kind of a tricky question. We are talking about a struggle for independence and the things that went into the struggle for independence. And perhaps we don't have all the evidence and the documents, and so we cannot say what all these founders did on the side. So I think it would be very judgmental for you to say, judgmental both on my part and on the part of whoever is asking the question, to say that those at the time were totally selfless. But they were selfless in their fight for democracy. They were relentless. They kept going forward. I think we see a semblance of that in a lot of our leadership today. But I think one of the things that has also happened at the time, there wasn't social media and there wasn't everything that follows your life so closely that you are consistently under public scrutiny 100% of the time. So I really would like this individual to also realize that the circumstances are different and perhaps the scrutiny to which we search some of our political leaders, it's as if you are consistently finding fault with them and waiting, hoping for them to fail or to make a slip so that someone else can take over. I also want to point that we should also remember that at that time, the competition wasn't what it is today. Today, you have how many candidates standing for members of parliament, even at the primaries before you go to the final. So all these things make it different. But yes, I do still believe that we do have a kind of leadership. People who go in with a selfless goal, sacrifice. One thing that we must realize is the person
from the finding that projects awarded at the national level are not very good.
I think you should mute everyone when we are ready to take the questions. Then okay.
Okay, so I hope you got what I was saying.
Yes.
That the circumstances are different at the time and today. The kind of scrutiny that we subject them to is also different at the time. But I still believe that we do find people who go in with that same selfless motive. If not, I don't think we would have reached where we've gotten to. So I would tell the person that yes, you find. Yes. Maybe some people don't exhibit those qualities, and that is what is making him doubtful. That do we still have that same selfless, motivated people who go in? But remember, that struggle was for independence. Now we've won it 65 years later. Different circumstances, different reasons why people would want to go into the political space. Yeah.
Right. And I also think that the benefits of hindsight is always very helpful, because these people we are talking about now, we are looking back at them and reflecting on them. I'm sure when they were living their lives in real time, people had challenges with them, but now they are saints, right? So we will also die and people say good things about us. So definitely, there is that. I don't know if the person on Zoom is ready to ask the question. If not, then I'll ask some of the questions that have come.
All right.
Okay.
I don't know if I can go ahead.
Yes, please.
So, my name is George Danquah. My issue is with the free SHS, right? By far, no two ways about it. Is a very good policy. But my question is, do we, in the name of free, just let everybody get into the schools, even though they do not meet the admission qualification? Because in time past, we all know that there are certain grades that there are free SHS are entering the schools that will not be on admission. And so, and that, if you speak to a lot of teachers on the ground, will tell you that a lot of students in class that really it is so difficult because the grades they came with and their output is so very poor. And so should it not be that once you qualify, you are admitted and then you get access to the free education, rather than a wholesale approach where everybody, whether you meet the admission grades or not, you enter into the system and you have to be taken care of? I think it's one area that if you speak to a lot of teachers, it's a worry, right?
Yes, thank you. Your point has been made. Dr. Irako, I think you should take this. Should everyone be given access just because it's free? And shouldn't you qualify first before you get in?
Yeah, so in as much as we want to give opportunity to every young person, we also want to ensure some standardization in what we do. Ultimately, if somebody graduates from Ghana, the goal is minimum SHS, but it doesn't end there. We expect that people would proceed and add value to themselves. It's value addition. And so, yes, I agree with the caller that as much as it is free, we need to be able to put standards in place so that you qualify, you benefit from this policy which is available to you. And that is why I indicated earlier in my submission that we need to listen to the concerns that have come up implementing this policy the last 4 or 5 years. We need to see what has been done. What have we done right? where are the loopholes so we can collectively strengthen them. I think if we also put a cap and standardize some of the things we're talking about, in a way sends a message that you can't just go through the system and expect to be boxed into a senior high school because it is free. You have to sit up and do what is needful. And so I agree, it's a legitimate concern, like other concerns which has come up. And I'm sure the policy implementers are listening, and they would have to, go back and look at some of these fine issues and address them. Thank you.
Right, thank you. This question, I think, is going to Dr. Ajimambudu. Someone says, the government must look deep into the Constitution and make the right amendments that address many of the challenges of our country. It looks like in opposition, there were a lot of things this government found wrong with the Constitution. And now we are in power and we seem to be ignoring those challenges. So that's what the person just brought in.
But that's more of a comment.
Yes, but do you want to read? It is a comment. It's a long one. I don't read all, but do you want to react to it? Just a summary.
Okay, all right. So the idea of governance is that when you come to power on the basis of a manifesto that you've put out there, on the basis of the things that you say you will do if you're given the mandate. And for instance, one of the things that I remember that the MPP in the run-up to the 2016 elections clearly set out that it will do was to essentially create the Office of the Special Prosecutor to tackle corruption and corruption-related offenses. And that is something that has been achieved. I do not know whether the MPP said categorically that they were going to review the Constitution per se, because we know that a holistic review of the Constitution was done in 2011, 2010, 2011, thereabout. The report was submitted to the president, then the late Atta Mills, somewhere, I think, early 2012 or something of that sort. But I do not know, I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not know whether the MPP said they were going to holistically review the Constitution per se. But being in government and recognizing some of the challenges that the Constitution poses, I think that any government would want to take a look at some of these things. But we need, and one typical example was the election of MMDCEs, which suffered a blow in Parliament. We all know what happened subsequently. That was one of the things that I know that this current president wanted to achieve. Maybe if we had done it, there may be some difference in our governance system. There may be more accountability, because if we are directly elected, and one thing is that the MMDCs, they are the direct persons responsible for development at the local levels. And because they are appointed by the president, really see themselves accountable to the people per se, so that if that amendment of the Constitution, for instance, had gone through, then you would say that at least something has been done in that regard. But to the extent that the ideas or the vision of the government has been frustrated because of opposition, or whether or not legitimate in terms of opposing the election of MMDC, we cannot say necessarily that they have failed or they haven't done what they said they were going to do in terms of the problems with the Constitution. And I think it goes back to the point I made earlier on, that it will depend on the particular philosophy that any particular government will belong to, whether to go down the route that was initially put out by the DC government, the holistic review of the Constitution, or whether to work with the Constitution as we go along and allow the courts to provide meaning to the provisions of the Constitution. For instance, recently, with the whole budget impasse that happened last year, it gave the opportunity for the Supreme Court to declare finally whether deputy speakers of parliament can vote or not, which was a sticking point in the Constitution. So I think that maybe as we go along and as people are willing to test the law in the courts, we'll be able to develop our constitutional jurisprudence. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't explore the need to amend the Constitution where there's a clear need to amend the Constitution.
Right, thank you. I am mindful that today is a holiday and a lot of us want to have the rest of the day, but some people also appear to have some very burning questions. So I'll give opportunity to 2 more people to ask questions. And please, when the questions come, answer in 2 minutes. So
Okay.
that's to my panel.
Can I come in? I'm Prince from
Please.
Sigi.
Yes.
Yeah, so
Prince from Sigi.
Yes, please. Firstly, would this lecture be available somewhere that we can access later? And secondly, and to Doctor, during the First Republic, we had the overstretch of the parliamentary powers when we had the deportation issues, and then the PDA with the Ria Koto issue. Do we foresee similar thing happening now or in the future? Because I think that happened because both Parliament and judiciary were under the control effectively by the executive. Is it possible to have such a situation reoccurring within the current dispensation?
Thank you, Prince from Sigi. I think it's to you, Dr. Ajimambudu.
Okay, the first question is to you. That would the lecture be available?
Yes, the lecture will be available on YouTube and also on on Facebook and also on our website later after today when it's edited.
Right. So, in terms of your question about whether we foresee a similar situation, I do not think so. And these are part of the lessons that we've learned from our previous experiences. So, for instance, if you look at our 1992 Constitution, like I said earlier on, even though Parliament is vested with legislative power, it is not every law that Parliament can pass. Parliament can pass a law, for instance, to prescribe a particular religion for all of us. Parliament can pass law, for instance, to declare Ghana as a one-party state or impose a particular political philosophy or ideology on the country. Parliament can't essentially undo the pronouncements of the Supreme Court or the court and things of that sort. So if you are asking whether we foresee a situation, I do not think so, because we have progressed and there are more safeguards that we have incorporated in our Constitution, and to the extent that the Constitution allows to change the acts of Parliament and even the executive. So the executive that cannot also do any and everything that it wants. It can be challenged, and there's a plethora of decisions where executive action have been struck down by our courts as being unconstitutional. Acts of Parliament have been struck down as being unconstitutional. So I think that the situation that we faced in the early parts of of independence, or immediate aftermath of independence, I do not foresee us going back to that point where essentially an executive can do any and everything that it wants, or Parliament can do any and everything that it wants, and the judiciary will sit back and not say anything. In recent times, there's been criticism against the judiciary, and I think to a large extent, those criticisms are unfair, especially when people do not take the time to appreciate the intricacies of the legal issues that are put before the courts before coming out with statements that tend to denigrate the whole institution of the judiciary and things of that sort, simply because of political gains and things of that sort. So no, I don't think we will go back to that point, but a lot more depends on us. We, the people, should be able to stand up and test the law. We should not sit back and watch the executive or the legislature to do any and everything that they want. We should hold our elected executives to account. And that's something that we have not been doing in the optimal way that we should, as it exists in other advanced democracies, where we know the legislative history of our legislators. We know the voting views or the views of our MPs on particular topics and issues. I think that's a point where we need to get. And we, the people ourselves, we also need to imbibe that spirit of our founding, that spirit of patriotism, that spirit of Ghanaianness, if we can put it that way, if we are to move into the new frontier that we expect to move into.
Thank you. Is there any more hands? I think we should be, we are wrapping up, not should be.
Please, can I?
All right, so someone, last person, please
right.
make your submission brief.
All right. So my name is Gladys Afuamusa, and I'm speaking currently from Danquah. I'm a member of the Youth Leadership Parliament. I want to state emphatically that I have a little issue with the youth participation in parliamentary affairs or political affairs. Recent times, the youth interest in politics has decreased enormously, and I think it's time we have to empower the youth to take up leadership mantles and political portfolios to prepare the youth to lead in our next future. So I'd like to ask, is there any initiatives or any plan to inculcate the spirit of patriotism and increase the motivation level of youth in our country for political issues?
Okay. I think if I get you, it's largely a comment about youth participation in politics, and then you were asking of ways to motivate the youth. These days, I am careful to mention the word motivate, because the moment you do, people are thinking about money. But as this lecture has just taught all of us, people stood up to the task not for any monetary gain, but just because they wanted independence for our dear nation. And so you don't need any more motivation than that you want the country to be developed beyond what it is now, to become better for future generations. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to it, to what she has said, but yes, indeed, we want the youth to actually engage in politics. And so, dear ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our Founders Day lecture series. We had Dr. Antoinette Sibudako discussing some individuals and groups of persons that fought really hard to bring independence to our country, and the lessons that we could learn from their example, the selfless ways that they committed to working towards bringing independence to our country. Then Dr. Ayrakwa came in to talk about the economic plans that started after gaining or regaining independence, as someone says we should be saying, and where we have gotten to. And he also tried to look at some flagship policies of the current government and how they all feed into each other to ensure that the path of growth that we are on will be sustained. Dr. Ajimambudu came in to help us go through the various constitutions and are there amendments or adoption? So adoption of new constitutions up to the 14th one, which is the 1992 constitution. And it may be bastardized. People may be calling for amendments and adoption of a 15th, but it is a very good constitution. And personally, I would say if it's not broken, why fix it? So if our constitution is giving me certain rights that I can live and enjoy my life, why would we want? Of course, there's always room for improvements, but I don't think we need to get a new constitution. So this is where we have come to acknowledge and thank for the help that they have given us to make this program a reality and a success. The first acknowledgement goes to Mr. Gabiasari Otredakun, the founding director of Danquah Institute. Sir, we are very grateful for all the support that you give us to be able to have such programs and all the other things that Danquah Institute does. We want to acknowledge Ms. Catherine Addy, Mr. Hayford Sian, the Director General of Ghana Library Authority. We want to acknowledge Ms. Angela Ofuriata, Dr. Kwabena Nyako, Nana Fredria Ofuriata, Ms. Mansan Williams, who is the Board Secretary of Danquah Institute. And then we also want to thank Ms. or Madam, she wants to be called Madam Abena Ansa Ejei, whose work in putting together some historic and documents inspired this lecture. Thank you, my panelists. Thank you for making this very, very educating and insightful. And I personally want to thank my daughter, Erajwa, who has appointed herself as my PA. And this morning she was making sure my lipstick was point because I'm going to. If we have left anybody out, I'm still acknowledging, I'm looking at you are sending me lists, so I'm going from page to page. Professor Angelo Furiata, we want to thank you. Our audience, Madam Elizabeth Ohene, our board members, Asasi Radio, thank you very much for giving us the live stream. Because I've acknowledged my daughter, you want me to acknowledge you. I want to acknowledge the production crew and all of you. Thank you for making time out of your day to come here today for us to see you. Everybody else that is online, thank you. There are a lot of you, I can't mention all, but Mr. Richard Ahiagba, our immediate past executive director, you are online. Thank you. Thank you to all of you that joined us. We are grateful. Enjoy the rest of the holiday and eat one bowl of fufu on me. Bye.
Holy God.